Duchenne muscular dystrophy situation.
Yeah.
So we're going to really do a deep dive here to, make sense of what's been in the news lately, what this gene therapy is really all about, and what it, means for DMD treatment as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you came to us with a lot of interest in this, especially after the recent reports. And to really get into it, we should kind of lay the foundation again. Talk about DMD itself and then how Elevidys is trying to, tackle that.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we say Duchenne muscular dystrophy or DMD,
Yeah.
The core problem is this lack of dystrophin, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so the sources you shared really go into detail on how DMD is really all about, these mutations in the dystrophin gene. And this protein is like super important. It's vital really for the structure of muscle fibers.
Mhm.
And without it, muscles just start to progressively weaken and degenerate.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, this is something that affects mainly males, right? Because it's tied to the X chromosome.
Right, exactly. So it's, this X-linked recessive inheritance pattern, which basically means it hits males primarily.
Okay.
And it's, it follows a pretty predictable course, unfortunately. Progressive muscle weakness. It usually leads to, people needing wheelchairs by their early teens. And as your data shows, the lifespan is shortened significantly, often just into the 20s or 30s because of breathing problems and heart issues.
Wow. So just a really tough condition to deal with.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Elevidys, which is this gene therapy developed by Sarepta Therapeutics. And the main idea is to deliver something to make up for that missing dystrophin.
Yeah, that's it. That's the strategy to kind of compensate for it, right?
Okay.
So Elevidys is designed to be like a one-time treatment, and it aims to get a modified version of the dystrophin gene into those muscle cells in people with DMD.
Right. Right. And then we get to the news that really caught your eye and kind of, sparked this whole thing, which is this recent report of a death in a patient who was treated with Elevidys.
Mm-hmm.
And this is understandably causing, concern. There was a big reaction to this. Sarepta's stock took a hit. So let's unpack, what we know about what happened.
Absolutely. So the information we have confirms that a 16-year-old patient who got Elevidys back in December passed away, and the cause of death was reported as acute liver failure. And this happened a few months after they got the gene therapy infusion.
And this is, significant because it's the first reported death in someone treated with Elevidys, right?
Exactly. And, while deaths in the world of gene therapy aren't completely unheard of, like your sources mentioned, those 2 deaths linked to Novartis' Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy back in 2022. This is the first one reported with Elevidys. So, yeah, it's significant.
Yeah, and it seems like liver issues in general are kind of a recurring worry with these kinds of therapies, huh?
Yeah. Liver injury is a known risk with Elevidys, and it's not unique to Elevidys. It's a risk with other gene therapies, too, especially the ones that use those adeno-associated viral vectors, or AAV vectors.
Right, AAV.
Which are basically the delivery trucks for the genes. They can sometimes trigger inflammation in the liver or other bad reactions.
But in this particular case, there was another factor at play, wasn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Sarepta, put out a statement pointing to something else.
Yeah, and this is a crucial detail.
Okay.
So they reported that tests after the patient passed showed a recent cytomegalovirus infection, so CMV.
Okay.
And the doctor treating the patient said this CMV infection could have been a factor in the acute liver failure.
So the liver failure might not have been just because of Elevidys?
Right. It suggests there could be an interaction happening there.
Interesting.
We know CMV can really affect the liver, so it could have been the gene therapy or the CMV or maybe both together that caused the liver failure. It's going to take more investigation to know for sure.
And of course, the market reacted to this news with a lot of, concern, and the stock price took a pretty big dive.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The data shows Sarepta's stock dropped a lot, over 26%.
Wow.
Which, really shows how sensitive things are around safety, especially for new therapies like Elevidys that are under a lot of scrutiny.
Right.
Investors know the risks are real in this field.
But it sounds like not all the analysts are seeing this as a complete setback.
Yeah.
The material you sent had some perspectives that were a bit more
Nuanced, yeah.
Nuanced, yeah.
Yeah, for example, Beer and Iman, an analyst at Piper Sandler, called it a black eye for Elevidys, acknowledging the bad press. But he also pointed out those promising long-term benefits they've seen in the patient data.
Right.
And he said he doesn't think the therapy will be pulled from the market because of this. So there's still belief in its potential, both in the medical world and among investors.
And that's an important point to remember, right?
Yeah.
That, the benefits might still outweigh the risks in a lot of people's minds. And the fact that so many patients have already been treated with Elevidys is a pretty big factor, too.
It is, yeah. Sarepta has said over 800 patients have received Elevidys either in trials or as their prescribed treatment.
Oh.
And having that many people gives us a wider context for this one death that was reported. And they've also said they're going to update the prescribing information for Elevidys to include this event and what they find out about it.
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into Elevidys itself.
Okay.
It uses that AAV vector to deliver a specific kind of genetic material, right? Is it a full working copy of the dystrophin gene?
It's not the full-length gene.
Okay.
No, your sources explain that Elevidys actually delivers a gene that makes what's called microdystrophin, so it's like a shortened version.
Okay.
But importantly, it still works. It's a functional version of the dystrophin protein that people with DMD are missing. And the goal is for this microdystrophin to kind of stabilize those muscle fibers and slow down that muscle damage that happens with DMD.
So not a total replacement, but more like a way to kind of soften the blow of not having the full protein.
Right.
And the FDA approval process for Elevidys has been sort of
layered.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So it first got what's called accelerated approval in June 2023, and that was just for a specific group of younger boys, ages 4 to 5, who could still walk. And then later, it got traditional approval for a slightly wider range of patients, ages 4 and older, who can still walk while keeping that accelerated approval for those who can't walk anymore.
Right. And if I understand correctly, the accelerated approval pathway is kind of like, it's based on early promising data, but it requires more studies to really confirm the long-term benefits, right?
Exactly. In this case for Elevidys, that initial accelerated approval was based mainly on showing that it could actually make the microdystrophin in the muscle tissue. And then the traditional approval came later, after they showed data from a late-stage trial that suggested some improvement in how well patients could function. Specifically, how long it took them to stand up from the floor and how far they could walk in 10 meters.
Okay, so that kind of leads us to what seems to be an ongoing point of discussion, right?
Yeah.
Which is that there have been some conflicting results from clinical trials.
Right.
The sources talk about this phase 3 trial called the EMBARK study and how it didn't actually meet its main goal, which was to show a big improvement in overall functional ability, like how well people can do everyday things. And that's kind of where some of the doubts about how well it works are coming from.
Yeah. For sure. So while those earlier studies did show microdystrophin in the muscle biopsies after treatment, that EMBARK trial not hitting its main goal has definitely created some debate and uncertainty about, how much Elevidys really helps patients across the board.
Yeah.
It shows how hard it is to translate those changes we see in the lab, like the microdystrophin being there, into actual improvements in how well someone functions day to day, especially with a complex condition like DMD.
And then there's even some speculation from analysts that the dosage of Elevidys could have been a factor in this recent death.
That's right. An analyst named Joseph Schwartz from Leerink brought up the idea that the 16-year-old patient who died might have gotten a higher dose of Elevidys because the dosage is usually based on weight.
Right.
And that's speculation at this point, but it raises important questions about, what the best dose is and if there are risks that are tied to the dose, especially in different groups of patients.
So zooming out a bit, this tragic event and all the complexities around Elevidys, they really fit into a bigger story about how we develop and use gene therapies, especially for rare diseases that are really serious.
Absolutely. We have to remember that gene therapy is still a fairly new field. And with that comes huge potential for treating diseases, but also risks that we're still figuring out how to manage. Your sources reminded us about those 2 patient deaths with Zolgensma, which uses AAV vectors too, and that shows that liver toxicity is a concern across the board for these types of treatments.
And news like this could make doctors more cautious about using these new therapies on their patients.
For sure. And that's a really important point that analysts have brought up. That quote from Bjorn Amin saying doctors really have to be careful about who they treat and when they treat with Elevidys or any gene therapy.
Yeah.
That emphasizes how this event could make doctors more hesitant, and it makes that risk-benefit analysis even more important.
It also puts a lot of responsibility on groups like the FDA.
Yeah, definitely. The FDA said they take this seriously, and they're going to investigate any reports of serious side effects or deaths tied to approved products. And that highlights their crucial role in keeping patients safe. They'll be looking at all the data very carefully to understand what factors might have contributed in this case.
It's a tough situation all around, right? You have DMD, which is this progressive and devastating disease with very few effective treatment options. And then you have these gene therapies that offer some hope, but also carry these potentially serious risks.
Exactly. That's the heart of the issue. And the accelerated approval pathway itself is meant to give people access to promising treatments for serious conditions where there aren't many other options.
Right.
But by its very nature, it means there's some uncertainty, which is why they do those post-market studies. And then the traditional approval for Elevidys, which was based on that later trial showing some functional improvement, just adds another layer to that whole weighing of risks and benefits.
And even with those risks, Sarepta still says that overall the benefits of Elevidys outweigh the risks, especially considering that there aren't many other treatments for DMD that can actually modify the disease.
Yeah, they're emphasizing that they're committed to studying the long-term benefits and safety of Elevidys through more clinical trials. And, for families dealing with a DMD diagnosis, the idea of a treatment that could potentially slow the disease down is a huge deal,
Right.
even with the risks. So how you weigh those benefits versus risks is really personal in these situations.
Okay, so just to recap, we talked about the sad death of a young patient
Yeah.
after being treated with Elevidys. The reported cause was acute liver failure, and there's a possibility that a CMV infection played a role.
Mm-hmm.
And we also went over those known risks with gene therapies in general, particularly the liver issues and
Yeah.
the ongoing discussions and questions about how effective Elevidys really is, even though it's been approved by the FDA.
Yeah, exactly. And this event really highlights how complex and challenging it is to develop and deliver these gene therapies, especially for rare and severe genetic disorders like DMD. It shows that balance that has to be struck between potentially life-changing benefits and the very real and sometimes life-threatening risks.
It really makes you think, given how serious and progressive DMD is and the potential of these gene therapies, how do we as a society decide how to weigh those potential benefits against the risks, especially when these rare but tragic events happen?
Yeah.
It makes us consider so many viewpoints: the patients and families who are desperate for treatments, the researchers who are pushing the limits of science, and the regulators who are responsible for making sure treatments are safe and effective for everyone.
It's a huge question to grapple with.
It is. Well, thanks for this deep dive. It's been really informative and thought-provoking.
Of course, it was my pleasure.
Right.
Thanks.
Take care.
You too.